and welcome to another edition of BNEWS In Depth. I'm your host, BNEWS Director Rich Hosford. This month we have two guests who are part of the Government Review Committee, a group that has been examining Burlington's town government and its forms, and has come up with some recommendations for the Board of Selectmen. I will be joined today by the chair of the committee, Kelly Pappas, and the vice chair, Roger Riggs. So please stay tuned and check out the interview. All right, so now I am joined by my two guests, as I mentioned at the top, Kelly Pappas and Roger Riggs. Thank you guys both for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you.
Nice to be here.
Oh, well, we're happy to have you in. So just kind of for people who may not have been following along, just sort of talk about kind of how the Government Review Committee got started and sort of in general what its goals and purpose was.
So in December, the selectmen put out a request for town members who wanted to participate in a committee that would take an overall look, in-depth look at the current governmental structure that we have in Burlington. From those who applied, the selectmen put together or appointed several town members to take part in this committee. We have town meeting members, former selectmen, former state rep.
Member of the Ways and Means Committee, and I think there are 4 town meeting members as part of the committee.
So a good kind of diverse group of outlooks or backgrounds from different people on the committee.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what was the mandate, I guess, is the official term, governmental term of the committee? What were you tasked with doing?
So I should have it memorized by now because I read the charge at the beginning of every single meeting we have, but I haven't memorized it. But generally speaking, what the selectmen asked us to do was to conduct some in-depth interviews, speak to other towns who have gone through government reviews, and come up with an opinion on whether further discussion was needed about the current governmental structure.
Yeah, the basic premise was there, over many years, various people have said, we ought to do this better, we ought to do this differently. But the question was, should we do anything at all? And
right.
That's sort of the first question that our committee looked at or was working toward in terms of a recommendation.
And what kind of things were taken into consideration when, during the discussions?
Well, so we started out with a couple of interviews of other towns, Winthrop and Tingsboro, representatives of the committees that had worked on their rechartering efforts, so they could familiarize us with the other overall process the other towns had gone through in terms of community involvement, the state regulations in terms of if you're reviewing your charter, there are some very well organized rules about you have to follow to do that. And then we moved on to interviewing some elected officials and the heads of departments within the town government to see what their view was of things like how they work with other departments, what other departments they work with, any little things that they thought could be done better.
We also took the opportunity to meet with outside organizations who strictly do this. They go into towns and they do really sort of efficiency reviews of how towns are run, and it's a public organization that does it. There are several. We interviewed one, and they will come into the town and they will conduct in-depth interviews, and that's what they do. So I will say that one of the I'm jumping ahead, but one of the recommendations that we will present to the selectmen on Monday night is that to the extent that further investigation into the town structure is warranted, our recommendation is strong that they involve an outside source to assist in the process.
Right. So to get some expert advice from outside rather than just
exactly
everything being internal. And what other kind of when talking to these other towns, what kind of feedback or information were you able to get from that process?
A big piece of it was how much community involvement they really needed in order to make sure that everybody knew what was going on, that the issues that were raised were sort of well understood and well communicated, that the proposed solutions were also broadly, discussed and reasonable for the community to adopt. It wasn't a centralized, committee just doesn't, it goes and does it, it makes a decision. They really, needed the community to give them feedback, and because ultimately, I think all of the processes end up going to the community for various votes. So if you don't have community buy-in sort of from the beginning and throughout the process, it's going to be very hard to get them to just sort of say, it's like, we're going to change these particular relationships or responsibilities or authorities.
And that was definitely a theme that we heard. We did hold a public forum, and one of the overwhelming themes from the public forum is that they wanted transparency, they wanted inclusion in the process, they wanted to be made aware of the steps and of what was going on, and some of the communities that we had in to speak with talked about multiple public forums and surveys and showing up. For example, Burlington just had their Burlington Day, showing up at places like that and just speaking to people, getting out there, making people aware.
Right, so really engaging with the community and getting the word out as much as possible.
Yeah.
And that's important because I think one of the things, especially early on in this process, I heard some concerns from people that I think maybe were based on misperceptions. So what are some of the things that that your committee was not doing that maybe people thought they were? Like, are we going to have a mayor next week?
No.
Is there other things like that that you heard, especially at the beginning of this process?
So in the beginning of the process, we had the town of Winthrop, which voted to become a city. We had them speak, and it was unfortunate because after that initial meeting, there were members of the community who started referring to us as the city committee.
Right.
And hashtag fake news. And really just spreading information that was completely incorrect, which was unfortunate. I can honestly say that everybody went into this committee with an open mind. And really, we spoke to several people. Nobody ever indicated that we wanted to become a city.
Right.
So that was probably the biggest misconception out there, was that we all came into this with the mindset out of the gate that we wanted Burlington to become a city, and that couldn't be farther from the truth.
Right.
And I think the other big one was that this committee was making a decision about how to reorganize.
Right.
No.
Yeah.
This committee was only to see whether there was enough reasons to move forward and do a more thorough study of what was going on and make a concrete proposal.
Right. So to make a recommendation for future recommendations. So
Exactly.
Right.
We're the committee to recommend another committee.
Right. Now, you talked about some of the feedback that you got from having other towns, other people come in. How did the conversations with our own, department heads and other members of the Burlington government go, and what kind of feedback or things did you learn, about how they are working and how they're situated right now?
I think they went well. The majority of the responses were that the town departments work well together. There is communication amongst them, which was great to hear. There were some questions that came up about appointed versus elected positions. There were questions that came up about the structure and how personnel reported up the chain. I mean, those were some of the biggest takeaways I heard.
Probably a couple of things had to do with the way that personnel issues are handled, that between elected boards and town government, they're different processes, a little bit different. And that's one area where further study, I think, is recommended. All the department heads basically said they had good working relationships with other departments. They didn't work with every other department, but several of them. I think there were one or two places where they said that for some issues that cross a lot of departments, getting a bit more sort of proactive communication among them might help speed things along. I think the pace of decision making was another, one of the other issues that came up. And as we know, a lot of big projects in town, they take quite a while to work through all the details and make sure that everything is the best possible route forward. So I think there are a few areas, definitely there are a few areas, some of which I think are just purely sort of operational things. It doesn't need to change in structure to improve. But that's, highlighting some of those issues maybe will help move things forward.
And in the public forum, one of the things that came up, which personally I think would be an asset to the community, was more of a centralized location for information. Given the commercial versus the residential tax basis and things of that nature, talking about a sort of an economic development plan or I forgot the other word,
Ombudsman?
Thank you.
Ombudsman?
Position within the government, and that came out at the public forum.
So.
Now, it was I'm trying to think, get back to kind of like the reason. So we got what you were doing, but do you have a sense of kind of why this conversation was started to begin with? Like where the idea came from? Is it just based on Burlington's, the size of the economy, the size of the budget? I don't think it's necessarily population, since it kind of has been the same for a while, but is it just a sense of the town and everything around it is becoming more complex, that this is why, to look at this at all to begin with?
Do you want to take that one?
Well, I think you touched on several issues that come into play. The town is growing. The population has been rising slowly but pretty steadily. The business community in town has been going through sort of maybe not renaissance, but a rebuilding and restructuring of things as both retail economies change and the business world is changing. All of our sort of heavy-duty problems like traffic and housing, they're getting worse. They're not getting better yet. Sort of in parallel, there's a master plan going through the planning board at the moment, which should help address long-term issues there. But those are sort of background issues across the town. Anything to add?
And I think it's been 50 years.
And it's been 50 years.
Since this was done?
Yeah, the last.
So with a budget of $135 million for the town, you can say that it's similar to a corporation, and corporations review their strategies regularly. So Burlington hasn't had this type of review in 50 years. So I think it was probably due.
And were individual positions examined, especially, I know one that was actually talked about at a Board of Selectmen meeting was the treasurer tax collector position, because we've had Brian Curtin for 42 years, I think.
Right.
And it's an elected position, but it's also one, when he came on, it was a few tens of millions, and as you said, now it's 120, 130 million. Whereas did the committee get down to that granular level of kind of looking at whether or not something like a position like that, with all its additional complexity, should maybe be appointed rather than elected, and sort of what was the discussion around issues, that one specifically, and others that might be similar?
So we actually didn't discuss specific positions, because again, we were charged with not necessarily making a recommendation on whether any one position should be appointed or elected. But we did have some overall discussions about appointments versus elections. Some of the information that came out was, well, people don't like to run for office. People don't like to have to participate in elections. So are you limiting the pool from which you can draw because people don't want to run a campaign? That was one of the things that came out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that also came out in interviewing with the other towns that had gone through reorganizations, is that in some cases qualified people are easier to identify and asked to serve from an appointed position as opposed to elected. It takes time, energy, and to run an election and get. But at the same time, there was a concern that you really do need, especially in some positions, the best qualified people you can get.
Right. It can't always
yeah.
be a popularity contest is one of the contentions that I've heard put forward,
Right.
which I think from Brian himself.
Right. I think, Brian, in what he was talking to us, which it was televised, it's like he did have an opinion about the checks and balances that are key at the sort of the top levels of town government to make sure that there's a balance between opinions and actions.
Yeah. Well, actually, maybe it was Mr. Hogan. I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, so I'm going to backtrack
That's
on where that
absolutely
opinion
fine.
came from. But I just know it was an issue that was raised that, there are certain positions in the town government where, you don't want, like you said, you need the most qualified person. So.
And one of the things that came out from some of the department heads were even if you switch this from elected to appointed, the people who are currently in these positions are doing a great job.
Right.
So ultimately, the recommendation would be to keep many of those people and just appoint them to what they're currently doing. But I think our recommendation is that that's part of the overall deeper in-depth look that needs to be done. Where is it appropriate?
Now, I know you had multiple meetings and you actually extended the life of the committee by a couple of months. So what were some of the other big issues or points of discussion that came up that maybe you weren't expecting, I guess, at the beginning?
I have to think on that one.
I mean, we covered a lot of area from various. So the state has a division of local services, which has provided quite a bit of support for different towns that have gone through reorganizations, and they write monthly articles, and they have a pretty good review of what other towns have done and the reasons they've changed, and that sort of leads people in a particular direction. So we had general idea of what the issues were. I don't think there were any surprises. Now maybe I was a little bit surprised by the public forum because nearly unanimously people said we like what the government, what town government is doing. We like the services. There aren't any sort of cross-cutting big problems. And from the point of view of delivering services to the residents, it's working well. So they were almost to a person very adverse to change, especially, right. Which I can understand. One doesn't like to be suggested, that some arbitrary change is good without knowing exactly what it is and what the impacts are. But in terms of unexpected things, well, the thing you mentioned about the presumption that we had a particular direction was one of the ones that caught me. I was surprised at because it was clear from the charter, and my sense of the town as a town meeting member and Ways and Means for a number of years that things are pretty well behaved. I mean, there are a lot of things going on and people have different opinions, but organizationally, I think it's a pretty stable situation and people like it that way.
Well, maybe not unexpected, but I guess what were some of the points of discussion that took the most energy or took time that a lot of people really wanted to drill down on?
So I heard quite a few people say, how's the saying go? If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yep.
Heard that quite a bit. Again, the personnel structure regarding the contracts and union versus not union, and 80% of the personnel reports up to the town manager and 20% reports to the department heads. There's a lot of discussion around that. There was a lot of discussion around needing a map guy to take care of all the GIS maps.
Oh.
Yeah, one person to do all of that.
Yeah, that is one of the opportunities within the town is to actually have a better way to sort of pull all the information around about what's where, traffic, water, sewer, all of the issues into one geographic database. And actually, we've been funding, the planning department has been an advocate, and we've been funding conversion of that, but we don't yet have a unified GIS system for the town. That did come up a couple of times.
Right.
So what I'm hearing is that for the most part, people are happy with how the town government works. They just want to know more about it, have more information, more access to information.
More access. Again, there's some slight changes that can be made here and there, but from the discussions that we heard, I don't think anybody feels like there needs to be a complete overhaul. I don't foresee anybody is going to recommend getting rid of town meeting, which I'm pretty sure was also an initial fear
I think so.
of several people when we first started.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that would be the fear of having a city committee.
Right.
Which you were not.
Which we were not.
But, that was what that would imply, city council rather than a town meeting. But
Right.
I'm pretty sure Burlington town meeting is quite entrenched in this community.
Considering that they would probably have to vote themselves out,
Yeah.
depending on which route you went.
So the state has rules about how to change and adopt new charters and update things. And I think there is one that can be done purely by citizens petition and the
There
vote
is.
of the voters at large. And I guess it's up to the future process
Yeah.
commission or whatever to decide how to proceed. But personally, I think we can probably do the things that really need some adjustment, could be improved, are pretty small scale. But we'll see when that next process works its way forward.
So at the, conclusion, and you're going to be before the Board of Selectmen on Monday.
Correct.
We're taping this on first week of August. What is today, the 10th?
Friday.
Second week of August.
Friday the 10th.
Friday the 10th, so you'll be on Board of Selectmen on the next Monday. What will be the recommendations of the committee?
So the recommendation, we voted, members in attendance, when we did vote, voted unanimously that the selectmen should move forward with a further study. Some of the ways in which they can accomplish, or some of the results that they can work towards, are a charter, which would require a charter review committee, or they can simply do, I say simply in quotations, they could do bylaw changes, which would not require an entire charter committee, and public citizen voting would require town meeting approval, though.
Oh, and the bylaw review committee. I mean, it still would be, it's part of the open process of any other revision of the town bylaws to take that smaller step to fix.
So the recommendation is just to have a group look at the charter, or is there certain parts of it that you are recommending be sort of checked out?
So we don't. So Burlington doesn't currently have a charter. So Burlington is run on bylaws.
That's true.
So they can, if they want to go the charter route, they can establish a charter committee, which the process of getting a charter instead of bylaws, as Roger said, is outlined by the state, the process by which they have to go. If they don't want to consider a charter, then they just want to consider changing bylaws, then they can either use the current town meeting bylaw committee, or they can establish a completely separate bylaw review committee.
But either way, the initial focus still has to be on what changes are, useful and prudent,
Right.
and sort of a reasonable thing to improve, things that will actually make an improvement. Once you decide what you want to change, then there's the mechanism of how you actually change it.
Right.
And so we don't want to jump too far ahead to the mechanism without, making sure that we figure out that this, will be beneficial.
Which is one of the reasons that we're recommending that they bring in an outside agency to assist.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody who has participated in this committee is a volunteer. I mean, we all have day jobs.
Right.
And hiring somebody who this is what they do, would provide a much higher level of detail than we were able to dig into.
And what were some of the, the reasonings that came behind this recommendation? What were some of the discussions that led up to, having either, the look at a possible charter or look at bylaw review? Is there specific parts of the structure of the town that you feel, or the committee feels, should be more closely examined?
We're not offering recommendations as to specific departments that
Right.
need change. As Roger said, the departments seem to work well together based on all the discussions that we've had. But there were some indications that there could be better communication. Better communication may be accomplished through a different reporting structure. So again, I think the things we're recommending that prompted our recommendation are really not huge changes that need to be made. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that anything that we talked about is fairly minor. And one observation that I think a couple of people made is that if you look at a chart of all the responsibilities in town, it's very broad. There isn't a lot of vertical responsibility and accountability except under the town administrator. And a few people thought that there ought to be more of a top-down structure, that some of that could be more efficient. You might get some more efficiencies out of it. So I think that'll have to be looked at. But there's no specific recommendation about, move this here or do that. We didn't get down to that level, and that would be part of future detailed recommendations of some other committee.
And again, looking at appointed versus elected positions.
All right, to
Taking a
take
deeper look at where should we have appointed versus elected.
Right.
And is that the big recommendation? Are there other parts of the report that?
That was one piece that led into why we're making this recommendation, because we think there are, Brian Curtin, for example.
Right.
So we think there are positions, we have a lot of elected positions, so there definitely are some positions that should be reviewed
Right.
for the appropriateness of elected versus appointed.
And that's kind of based on just the rise in complexity of certain positions and.
Right.
Yeah.
And the timing was a little bit stimulated by the retirement of both the town administrator and the treasurer, or
Sure.
at least their ideas to retire. Any opportunity like that gives you a chance to say, well, should we look at this again and figure out whether something's better or different before we just sort of do it again. So I think that the timing is an opportunity. But I think a couple of times during the process, there was this like, well, we want to be able to do something quick, like within 6 months or a year, versus, are we willing to go the state complete new charter route takes a couple of years of voting and cycles and stuff. So it takes a long time. And my sense is that we don't need to hurry it. I mean, yes, we have some events that are occurring that might stimulate it, but if we're going to make changes, we need to make them for the next 50 years.
Right. Yeah. Make changes that
The right reason.
that are based on the right reasons. A lot of discussion and a lot of contemplation, rather than someone's retiring, let's make a change.
Exactly.
Just for the sake or a knee-jerk reaction to a change that's coming from the outside. Well, very good. And so, what's the next step? I know you're giving the report on Monday. Is there anything more for this committee to do?
Not necessarily. So, yes, so presenting to the selectmen on Monday, on August 13th, and then the selectmen will have to vote on what their next steps are and what the process is that they want to follow.
Right.
And if they take your recommendation, what would be a possible sort of, future kind of plan or process that would then, get kicked off?
So that depends. If they want to do a charter review, if they want to establish a full charter review committee, again, those steps are outlined by the state. It requires a vote on whether or not you want to have a charter. If you want the charter review, then you have to vote to establish it. And these are public elections.
Right.
You have to vote to establish a charter committee, which means people will have to potentially have to campaign to be on the charter committee.
Actually, the very beginning of that process is a citizen's petition
Right.
to create a charter committee, which then leads into the rest of the process of electing just a townwide vote to decide whether to do it and to elect commissioners.
And that's a citizen's position to. What's the process for that?
I think it's the usual, go out and gather signatures
Right.
for a particular initiative. And so all of this is outlined by the state guidelines for creating a commission.
All right. So pretty much now it's in the hands of the selectmen after.
It is.
After this. Well, last thing I want to end in, I guess we'll wrap up. You mentioned this. This is a committee of people who come from different, either, some of them elected, some appointed officials, just some members of the community. They have day jobs. This was a kind of a long process. I know some of your meetings went quite lengthy. Just talk about, the people who and the commitment that they had to doing this, and sort of as the chair and vice chair, your sense of everybody's dedication to the town expressed through by participating in this.
So again, to be appointed to this committee in the first place, you had to apply.
Mm-hmm.
And you had to give some background on who you are and what you do and why you would be appropriate for the committee. We had multiple meetings. There was a significant amount of background information that was provided throughout the entire process that people had to really digest. What else were
Well, in terms of the individuals, we've had, many of them had been in town, been residents in town and served on town boards. They were all very, they were engaged in the process. They realized there were trade-offs and they were looking, eager to look at, what's going on in the town and what are the relationships between the departments, and to hear what people had to say. I think, you mentioned it took many meetings. We had a few interruptions in our meeting schedule, and so it wasn't, it was probably typical for many committees that have a regular meeting period for a while. But participation was good. I think it worked very well.
Excellent. Well, very good. So just to recap real quick, the recommendation is for just to the Board of Selectmen to have to continue to look at things, to look at the structure of government.
correct?
No big changes, no recommendation to appoint anyone as mayor anytime soon.
No mayors. No.
All right, very good. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for coming on and taking one more meeting to discuss all the meetings that you've had up to this point.
Thank
I really
you.
appreciate it. And there you have it. A look at the recommendation coming up from the Government Review Committee. I'd like to thank my guests, Chair Kelly Pappas and Vice Chair Roger Riggs. I'd also like to thank all of you for watching. I am your host, BNEWS Director Rich Hosford, and we will see you next month on the next edition of BNews In Depth.